with the dawning of the empirical age, let's say, there's this idea that you can derive valid information from sense data, especially if you contrast that sense data rigorously with that of others. Okay, so that's sort of the foundation for the scientific method in some sense. But then I think this is with Immanuel Kant. There's an objection to that, which is that, well, you can't make the presupposition that that sense data enters your cognitive apparatus, your apparatus of understanding, without a priori structuring. Right. And it seems to me that that's where the postmodernists really go after the modernists. It's that given that you have to have a very complex perceptual structure that modern people might say was instantiated as a consequence of biological evolution, you can't make the case that what you're receiving from the external world is something like pure information. It's always subject to some very difficult to delimit degree to interpretation. And then you also have to take into account the fact of that a priori structure and what it might mean for your concepts of objective reality. And then that's Kant, I think, if I've got that right.
Right. Well, the postmoderns will use both of those strategies, the anti-empiricist strategy and the anti-rationalist strategy. And what's important about Kant, right, is that Kant is integrating, right, both of those anti-strategies. So in the generations before Kant, the skeptical arguments about perception, right, directed against the empiricists. The empiricists want to say everything is based on observational data. But then if you don't have good answers about hallucinations and relativity and illusions, right, and so forth, then it seems like your structure, your intellectual structure, whatever it comes to be, if it's all based on probabilistic or possibly faulty perceptual data, then the whole thing is a tottering like mess. And by the time we get to Kant, the empiricist tradition is largely unable to respond right to those kinds of objections. And so Kant is recognizing and saying, all right, we've been trying now for a couple of centuries. We haven't been able to do so successfully. We're not going to be able to do so. Now, you also, though, nicely, right, emphasize that one of the other responses, right, had been on the rationalist side, which is to say, well, no, you don't start with pure empirical data. Instead, that we do have perhaps some innate a priori structures built into the human mind, how they got there. Maybe they're put there by God. Maybe they're put there naturalistically, right, or whatever. But what enables us to have legitimate knowledge, right, is that our empirical data comes in and it is filtered and structured by these pre-existing, right, cognitive structures as well. Now, the problem with that side, right, of the line, and this is also well worked out by the time we get to the Kantian, is to say, well, if you're starting with inbuilt cognitive structures, and everything that comes in, so to speak, goes through this structuring machine, and you're aware of the outputs, right? That's what's presented to your mind. Well, how do you know that those inbuilt structures, right, have anything to do with the way reality actually is out there? It seems like then what you are stuck with is the end result of a subjective processing, and there is no way for you, so to speak, to jump outside of your head, right, to compare the end result with the way the world actually is, right, independently of how your mind has structured the awareness. So once again, you're stuck rather in a rather subjective place. And again, the importance of Kant here is then he's also looking at this more rationalist tradition, and he's saying, well, look, again, we've been trying now for a couple of centuries to work these things out, you know, from Descartes to Spinoza, Leibniz, and the others, and rationalism also, right, has reached a dead end. So we're not going to be able to do so. So Kant is in effect standing at the end of these two traditions and saying, the skeptics have it right on both sides. Both the empiricist and the rationalist tradition fail. There is no way for us to objectively come to know an external reality. We're stuck in some sort of deep subjectivism.
Okay, so I don't know now whether to talk a little bit about the American pragmatic approach to that, or whether maybe we should go ahead and continue our discussion of postmodernists, because they're developing these claims.
Absolutely. And some of the postmodernists do describe themselves as neo-pragmatists, like Richard Rorty, for example. So yes, that's exactly a direction that's worth going.
Okay. So my understanding of that, if I was going to defend the modernist tradition, let's say, I would say that we have instantiated within us an a priori perceptual structure that's a consequence of millions, billions of years, for that matter, of biological evolution. And it has it has emerged in tandem with continual correction of its presuppositions by the selection process. But it's still subject to error because we have a very limited viewpoint as specific individuals, and we can not only are we limited, but we also make, you might say, moral errors, and I'll get back to that cloud our judgment. And so in an attempt to expand our purview and rectify those errors, we do two things. We test our hypothesis practically against the world, which is to say, we say, here's a theory of reality, we act it out. If the theory of reality is sufficiently correct, when we act it out, we get what we want. And then that's sufficient proof for the validity of the theory. It's not absolute proof, but it's sufficient proof. And then the other thing we do, and I think this has been paid attention to much less, except by thinkers such as Piaget, is that we further constrain our presuppositions about reality with the necessity of constructing theories that are also acceptable to people around us. So they have to be integratable within the currently existing social contract, and they have to be functionally appropriate in the external world. And that's a nice set of constraints, and it seems to me that, at least in some part, goes a long ways to answering the objections to the limits of the scientific method that have been discussed, that were discussed, and that you just discussed, that have been discussed historically and that you just summarized.
Okay. All right. I'm sympathetic to much of what you went through. In fact, a 5-point response to the kinds of arguments that have been laid out. But you're actually putting me in the position then of defending the postmodern tradition, about how it would undercut each of those components. So if you take, for example, evolutionary epistemology, and you give a nice sketch of one standard evolutionary epistemological framing, which would say, okay, maybe we have these inbuilt a priori structures, but we can rely upon them because here we are standing at the long end of hundreds of thousands or millions of years of evolution, and they would not have survived or enabled us to survive had they not served some sort of reliable cognitive role in accurately representing the way the world works. Now, with the postmodern, this is actually too early for the postmoderns, although the postmoderns will agree with this, is to say that all of that kind of begs the question, in a very deep way against the kind of skeptical objections that we're raising. Because in order to make that paragraph-long description, of what evolutionary epistemology is, what I have to do is take for granted, as basic assumptions, certain truth, about the world. That, for example, there is an external world, that we are biological creatures, that we have inbuilt structures, that those structures are evolutionarily responsive and conditioned by changing forces, and so forth. And if you take those assumptions, to be true, then as a consequence, or as a conclusion, you can infer that therefore the intellectual products that come out of our cognitive processing are reliable, in some way. But where did you get those 4 premises from? How do you know, that there is an external world? How do you know that we are biological creatures? How do you know that evolution is true with all of the historical knowledge that's necessary to reach the conclusion that evolution is true? All of that presupposes that we have legitimate cognitive methods to come to understand the world. But our having legitimate cognitive processes to understand the world, that's exactly what we are arguing about in the first place. And you can't just assume that, for then the sake of coming up with some premises that are then in turn going to validate those cognitive processes. So something like that, we'll say, is there's a big circle or circular reasoning problem that evolutionary epistemology finds itself trapped in. Now, I think there are some responses to that, and this is just the first back and forth on that particular debate, but that is the kind of response that would be there. So the third and fourth, if I'm keeping track accurately, is to say that we also have constraints with respect to ourselves, that if we have a certain set of hypotheses or a certain set of theories, and we're testing them out, we will accept those that give us what we want, right? So, or what I want, right, so to speak. Right? And I'm also necessarily in a social situation, so what I need to do is check my results against the results of others, peer review, experiment replication, right, and so forth.
Yeah, ability to live in the same household.
Yes, absolutely, right, more prosaically, right, sharing our frameworks, right, with each other, right, and so on. And so if, so to speak, and this is the more pragmatist orientation, if we then say we have a theory, right, or a set of principles or guidelines or whatever, and they do enable me successfully to navigate the world, right, to get what I want, or they do enable me to navigate my social world to get us what we want, then they're reliable, true.